Imagine for a second that you're sitting in a briefing room in the Pentagon. It's the winter of 2026. You're looking at a map of the North Atlantic, and someone just drew a line between 3 points. Greenland, Iceland, the United Kingdom. This line, this gap is called the GIUK Gap. And the officer briefing you says something that makes your blood run cold. If we lose control of this choke point, Russian nuclear submarines can reach the Atlantic undetected. If that happens, we lose the ability to defend the eastern seaboard. We lose early warning for ballistic missiles. We lose the war before it starts. And you realize that the entire security architecture of the North Atlantic, the thing that has kept NATO alive for 75 years, hinges on a frozen island with 57,000 people that most Americans couldn't find on a map. Welcome to Greenland, the place that just became the most important piece of real estate on Earth, and the reason Donald Trump is willing to threaten military action against a NATO ally to take it. Here's what nobody told you while you were scrolling past the headlines. This isn't about ego. This isn't about expanding the map. This is about the fact that climate change is opening the Arctic, Russia and China are moving in, and the United States just realized it's about to lose control of the one geographic choke point that has protected North America from European wars for a century. Today we're going to break down exactly why Greenland suddenly matters, why the GIUK Gap is the most important place you've never heard of, why China and Russia are circling like sharks, and why Trump's threat to annex Greenland might be the most rational thing he's said in years. Let's get into it. 1. The GIUK Gap, the invisible wall that protects America. Pop quiz. What's the most strategically important line on Earth that isn't a border? It's not the 38th parallel in Korea. It's not the line of control in Kashmir. It's the GIUK Gap. Greenland, Iceland, United Kingdom. 3 points that form a choke point between the Arctic Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean. For 75 years, this gap has been the front line of the Cold War, and most people have no idea it exists. Here's why it matters. If you're a Russian submarine captain sitting in a base near Murmansk and you want to threaten the United States, you have a problem. You're in the Arctic. Your target is in the Atlantic. And to get from point A to point B, you have to squeeze through a narrow corridor of ocean between Greenland and Iceland, or between Iceland and the United Kingdom. That corridor is watched. NATO has spent decades planting underwater sensors, deploying patrol aircraft, and tracking every single surface ship and submarine that tries to pass through. It's a kill zone, a monitored gateway, an acoustic tripwire. If you control Greenland, you control the western wall of that gate. If you lose Greenland, the gate swings open. And Russian submarines, the kind carrying nuclear missiles, can slip into the Atlantic undetected. This is not theoretical. During World War II, the Battle of the Atlantic was fought in these waters. German U-boats tried to cut off supplies to Britain by sinking convoys crossing the Atlantic. The Allies won that battle by controlling the GIUK Gap. They monitored it, they patrolled it, they choked off the threat. During the Cold War, the same logic applied. Soviet submarines tried to reach the Atlantic to threaten American cities. NATO tracked them through the GIUK Gap. The United States built a massive airbase in Greenland, Thule Air Base, now called Patuxent Space Base, specifically to monitor Soviet activity and provide early warning for ballistic missile launches. Patuxent is the northernmost U.S. military installation on Earth. It hosts a powerful early warning radar that scans continuously for missile launches over the Polar Route. It has a deep-water port, it has an active airfield, and it sits directly on the route that Russian bombers and missiles would take to hit the eastern seaboard. If access to Patuxent were ever compromised, early warning coverage over the Arctic would be significantly weakened. The United States would lose precious minutes of reaction time in the event of a nuclear strike. Minutes that could mean the difference between intercepting a missile and watching a city disappear. This is why military planners call Greenland the unsinkable aircraft carrier. You can sink a ship, you can disable a carrier, but you cannot sink an island. Control of Greenland gives permanent forward basing for radar, aircraft, sensors, and early warning systems sitting directly between North America, Europe, and Russia. Right now, the United States has access to Greenland through a 1951 defense agreement with Denmark. Denmark owns Greenland. The U.S. rents the military space. It works. It's been working for 73 years. But here's the problem. Denmark is 2,000 miles away. Denmark has a population of 6 million and a military budget of $7 billion. Denmark cannot defend Greenland from a determined adversary. And two adversaries, Russia and China, are moving into the Arctic faster than anyone predicted. And that brings us to the second reason Greenland suddenly matters. The ice is melting, and when the ice melts, new shipping routes open, new resources become accessible, and the Arctic stops being a frozen wasteland and starts being the most valuable trade corridor on the planet. 2. The melting Arctic. Climate change is a geopolitical weapon. Here's the darkest irony of the 21st century. Climate change is a catastrophe for the planet, but it's a goldmine for global shipping. For most of human history, the Arctic Ocean was impassable. If you wanted to ship goods from Shanghai to Rotterdam, you took the long route, through the South China Sea, across the Indian Ocean, up through the Suez Canal. That journey takes 30 to 40 days, but as Arctic ice retreats, new routes are opening. The Northern Sea Route, hugging the Siberian coastline, can shave 10 to 15 days off that journey. That's a 25% to 35% reduction in transit time. Fuel savings alone translate into billions of dollars annually for global shipping companies. In 2025, the Northern Sea Route saw 107 transits. That's more than double the number from a decade ago. Most of those ships were carrying Russian oil and coal to China. But the route is expanding. Container ships are using it, LNG carriers are using it, it's becoming viable. And there's another route on the horizon, the Transpolar Sea Route. This route doesn't hug the coastline. It cuts straight across the central Arctic Ocean, directly over the North Pole. It's not commercially reliable yet. The ice is still too thick for most of the year. But climate models predict that by the 2040s, regular cargo ships will be able to use it during summer months. Greenland sits adjacent to the gateways of these routes. Whoever builds the ports, refueling hubs, repair yards, and search and rescue infrastructure nearby effectively becomes the toll booth of the Arctic economy. China sees this. In 2018, China released its Arctic policy, calling the region a polar Silk Road. China wants to use Arctic shipping to move goods into Europe faster and to diversify away from vulnerable choke points like the Suez Canal, which can be blocked by a single stuck ship, or the Strait of Malacca, which could be shut down in a conflict. Russia already charges transit fees, escort costs, and navigation services along its Arctic coastline. Ships using the Northern Sea Route have to pay Russia for icebreaker support and pilotage. Russia is monetizing climate change. But here's the catch. None of this infrastructure exists in Greenland. There are few deepwater ports, limited emergency facilities, minimal shipping services. Building it requires massive capital. If Denmark can't afford to build it, and the United States doesn't step in, someone else will. And the country with the biggest infrastructure checkbook happens to be China. And that's not speculation. China has already made moves in Greenland. In 2016, a Chinese state-affiliated company called Shanghai Resources acquired a stake in the Kvanefjeld rare earth mining project in southern Greenland. The project was supposed to become one of the world's largest rare earth and uranium mines. It was halted in 2021 when Greenland reinstated a ban on uranium mining. But the Chinese stake remains. Greenland opened a representation office in Beijing in 2023. Greenland's foreign minister has publicly identified closer cooperation with China as a priority. There have been discussions about a free trade agreement between Greenland and China. This is the nightmare scenario for Washington. China gaining operational influence in Greenland not through military force, not through invasion, but through debt, ports, airports, and logistics access. The same playbook China used in Sri Lanka, in Djibouti, in Pakistan. If China builds the ports in Greenland, China writes the rules. China controls access. And suddenly, the GIUK Gap becomes far harder for NATO to secure. So when Trump says the United States needs to control Greenland, he's not just talking about missiles and radar. He's talking about preventing China from turning the Arctic into the next South China Sea. 3. The treasure buried under the ice. Rare earths and the supply chain war. Okay, let's talk about your smartphone. Every single component inside it, the screen, the battery, the processor, the camera, relies on something called rare earth elements. These are materials with names you can't pronounce. Neodymium, dysprosium, terbium, yttrium, praseodymium. But without them, modern technology doesn't exist. Electric cars don't exist. Wind turbines don't exist. Fighter jets don't exist. Guided missiles don't exist. MRI machines don't exist. Here's the problem. China controls roughly 70% to 90% of global rare earth processing capacity. Even when rare earths are mined in other countries, they usually get shipped to China for refining. China has a near monopoly on the entire supply chain. If Beijing ever decided to cut off rare earth exports, which they did partially in 2025 with heavy rare earths, Western manufacturing would face severe disruptions. Defense production would slow. The entire industrial base of the West would feel the shock. Greenland represents one of the few realistic paths to breaking that monopoly. Greenland is estimated to hold approximately 1.5 million tons of rare earth reserves. That's the 8th largest in the world. It rivals the United States at 1.9 million tons. The Kvanefjeld deposit in southern Greenland is the 3rd largest known land deposit of rare earths on the planet. It contains over 11 million metric tons of reserves, including 370,000 metric tons of heavy rare earths, the kind used in advanced defense systems, robotics, semiconductors, and aerospace applications. The Tanbreeze deposit, also in southern Greenland, is estimated to contain 28.2 million metric tons of rare earths. It could potentially be the largest rare earth deposit in the world. But here's the uncomfortable reality. These deposits haven't been developed yet. Kvanefjeld has been stuck in permitting hell for a decade. The project was halted in 2021 because of environmental concerns over uranium byproducts. Tanbreeze is even further behind, still in preliminary economic assessment. And even if mining started tomorrow, there are massive challenges. The ore grades in Greenland are low, less than 1% rare earth content. Compare that to mines in China and Australia, where ore grades are 5% to 10%. Low grades mean you have to move 10 times the volume of rock to get the same amount of usable material. Greenland has no infrastructure, no roads between towns, no railways, no power grid. Everything moves by air or boat. Building the infrastructure to support large-scale mining would cost tens of billions of dollars and take a decade or more. And here's the kicker. Even if you successfully mine rare earths in Greenland, you still have to process them. And the only place in the world with the processing capacity at scale is China. So the rare earths argument is a long-term play. It's not about solving the supply chain problem tomorrow. It's about preventing China from owning both the deposits and the processing capacity. It's about diversifying the supply chain over the next 10 to 20 years. But Trump's interest in Greenland isn't just about rare earths. It's not even primarily about rare earths. It's about the fact that Russia and China are already there, and they're not waiting for permission. 4. Russia and China are already moving in. Let me show you what's actually happening in the Arctic right now. Because this isn't a future threat. This is present tense. Russia has reopened Soviet-era Arctic bases. Russia has deployed S-400 air defense systems to the Arctic. Russia has built new icebreakers specifically for the Northern Sea Route. Russia has strengthened its Northern Fleet, the fleet responsible for operating in the Arctic and North Atlantic. In March 2025, Russian President Vladimir Putin said at the International Arctic Forum, "Russia has never threatened anyone in the Arctic, but we will closely follow the developments and mount an appropriate response by increasing our military capability and modernizing military infrastructure." In 2025, oil shipments from Russia to China through the Northern Sea Route surged by 25%. Russian crude is flowing to China via the Arctic, bypassing Western-controlled chokepoints. China has expanded its Arctic research efforts. China operates research stations in Norway, Iceland, Sweden, and Finland. China has planned a research and satellite ground station in Greenland. Research stations sound innocent, but dual-use facilities can support both scientific research and military intelligence gathering. The United States and NATO are watching this with growing alarm. In 2024, NATO conducted Exercise Nordic Response, the largest Arctic military exercise in decades. Over 20,000 troops from 13 nations practiced Arctic warfare techniques. The U.S. Department of Defense released a report in early 2025 expressing concerns about Chinese military activity in the Arctic. The report noted that China has massively expanded its Arctic footprint since gaining observer status on the Arctic Council in 2013. China sent a naval flotilla into the Bering Sea for the first time in 2015. In September 2022, China and Russia conducted a combined naval patrol in the Bering Sea. These are not research vessels. These are warships. Trump's claim that Greenland is covered with Russian and Chinese ships is hyperbolic. But the underlying concern is real. Russia and China are increasing their presence in the Arctic. They are building infrastructure. They are conducting military exercises. And they are doing it while the United States has been distracted by wars in the Middle East and Asia. If the United States loses influence in Greenland, it loses the ability to monitor and control access to the North Atlantic. It loses early warning capability for missiles. It loses forward basing for aircraft and sensors. And it hands Russia and China a strategic victory without firing a shot. 5. The independence trap. How to buy Greenland without buying it. Now here's where the strategy gets interesting. Because Trump's talk about buying Greenland is clumsy, it's politically toxic. It pisses off Denmark, a NATO ally. It pisses off the European Union. And it makes Greenlanders, who overwhelmingly oppose U.S. control, dig in their heels. But there's another way to gain control of Greenland. And it doesn't require writing a check to Denmark. It requires waiting for Greenland to become independent, and then stepping in as the replacement partner. Greenland is a self-governing territory within the Kingdom of Denmark. It has its own language, its own parliament, its own flag, and control over most domestic policy. But Denmark still controls foreign policy and defense. And every year, Denmark sends Greenland a block grant of roughly $600 million US. That money covers more than half of Greenland's public budget. Polls consistently show that a strong majority of Greenlanders, between 60% and 80%, support independence in principle. The dream of full sovereignty is real, but there's a problem. Without Denmark's money, the economy collapses overnight. Greenland cannot afford to be independent unless someone replaces that funding, and that creates an opportunity. If Greenland votes for independence, the Danish subsidy phases out. The new government urgently needs replacement funding. And suddenly, whoever steps in first with financing, investment, and security guarantees becomes the most important partner in the country. If the United States were to say, "Congratulations on your independence. We'll help replace that funding, invest in infrastructure, and guarantee security in exchange for expanded military access and preferential investment rights," Washington would gain enormous strategic leverage without ever owning Greenland. We're already seeing the groundwork. In 2020, the United States reopened a consulate in GIUK, Greenland's capital, for the first time since the 1950s. Alongside it came a $12 million civilian aid package aimed at business development and infrastructure. Denmark publicly welcomed the move, but privately, Danish officials were clearly uneasy. The United States was establishing a permanent foothold inside what had been Copenhagen's backyard for 3 centuries. It's the geopolitical equivalent of quietly saying, "You don't need your old partner anymore. We can take care of you." China doesn't lecture countries about human rights or environmental standards. China just writes checks. So the real race isn't to buy Greenland. It's a race to become the preferred partner of a future independent Greenland. And right now, that race is wide open. 6. Trump's threat and the NATO crisis. And now we're here, January 2026. Trump just pulled off a military operation in Venezuela, capturing President Nicolas Maduro and flying him to New York in handcuffs. And 24 hours later, Trump doubles down on Greenland. The White House confirms that Trump and his national security team are actively exploring a range of options to secure Greenland, including utilizing the U.S. military. The President of the United States is threatening military action against a NATO ally, not Russia, not China, Denmark, a founding member of NATO. The response from Europe has been unprecedented. Denmark's prime minister called the rhetoric absurd. Sweden's prime minister used the word blackmail. Germany warned that any coercive move would undermine the foundations of the international order. France, Germany, and Canada publicly reiterated their support for Greenland's sovereignty. This is the biggest crisis in the transatlantic relationship in either of Trump's presidencies. Analysts are openly questioning whether NATO can survive this. Because if the United States is willing to threaten one ally, Denmark, why would any other ally believe the U.S. will honor Article 5, the Mutual Defense Clause, if they're attacked? Senator Mark Warner, a Democrat from Virginia, said, "The only country that is benefiting the most from this chaos are both Russia and China. The United States is alienating its closest allies, and all Putin and Xi have to do is sit back and wait." But here's the thing. Trump's rhetoric is reckless. His delivery is terrible. But the underlying strategic logic is sound. Greenland is strategically vital. The GIUK Gap is a choke point that protects North America. The Arctic is opening. Russia and China are moving in. And Denmark, with a military budget of $7 billion and no Arctic naval capability, cannot defend Greenland from a determined adversary. The United States needs more than access. It needs control. It needs the ability to expand radar installations, deploy missile interceptors, build ports, and station forces without negotiating with Copenhagen every time. The question isn't whether the United States needs Greenland. The question is whether Trump's approach, threatening allies and using military rhetoric, is the right way to get it. The answer is probably no. Diplomacy, investment, and patience would work better. But Trump isn't a patient man, and he's looking at the same maps Pentagon planners are looking at. He's seeing Russian submarines in the GIUK Gap, he's seeing Chinese ships in the Bering Sea, and he's seeing a strategic vulnerability that has been ignored for too long. 7. Final thoughts. The new Arctic Cold War. So here we are. Greenland, a frozen island with a population smaller than a mid-sized American city, has become the center of a geopolitical storm. The ice is melting. The Arctic is opening. Russia and China are militarizing the region. New shipping routes are cutting transit times by 30%. Rare earth deposits worth trillions of dollars are becoming accessible. And the GIUK Gap, the choke point that has protected the North Atlantic for 75 years, is under threat. Trump sees this, the Pentagon sees this, NATO sees this, and everyone is scrambling to figure out what comes next. The United States has 3 options. 1, maintain the status quo, keep the 1951 agreement with Denmark and hope it's enough. 2, invest heavily in Greenland through aid, infrastructure, and partnerships, and wait for independence. 3, take aggressive action, economic or military, to secure control now. Trump is clearly leaning toward option 3. Europe is horrified, Greenland is defiant. And the world is watching to see if the United States is willing to fracture NATO to secure the Arctic. But here's the brutal truth. Greenland matters, not because Trump says so, not because it's a vanity project, but because the map is changing. The Arctic is no longer a frozen wasteland. It's the next frontier of global competition, and whoever controls the choke points, the ports, and the infrastructure will dominate the 21st century. For 500 years, the Atlantic Ocean was the center of global power. For the last 50 years, it was the Pacific. But the next 50 years will be decided in the north, And Greenland is the key that unlocks the Arctic. The United States sees Greenland as a shield. China sees it as a gateway. Russia sees it as a buffer. Denmark sees it as a burden. And the Greenlanders? They mostly just want to be left alone. The question isn't whether Greenland will become more valuable. It already has. The question is how the world handles that value. With diplomacy, with investment, or with force. The ice is melting. And as it disappears, it's revealing the most dangerous thing of all. Competition, the kind that starts cold wars, and sometimes hot ones. Thanks for watching. If you want to understand what happens when superpowers fight over strategic choke points, check out our video on the Strait of Hormuz. And if you think the Arctic is the last frontier, wait until you see what's happening in space. Hit like, hit subscribe, and welcome to the new Cold War. It's not in Europe anymore, it's at the top of the world, or predictable.